Hi. Okay, well, we've got with us Scott Breadmore from LiveEO and Thomas Carr from Osapiens. Thanks, chaps, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Is the mic working? Yeah, good.
Close enough.
Okay. So as you've seen, EUDR is imposing a whole set of new challenges in the book and many other industries concerning supply chain traceability. There's a whole range of software solutions that emerged out there. You guys are representing two of them. I wanted to ask you, first of all, some contextual questions around EUDR, just to get your views on a few things, if we could start there. So if we start with Scott, from your perspective, when you cut through all the complexity we just had in the previous slides, what for you is EUDR all about?
Well, at its core, it's about transparency and accountability, right? It's forcing people landing products or companies, organizations landing the product into the EU to demonstrate that they're not sourcing product from deforested areas, right? So it's about that transparency and accountability. And we work in a climate when you think about your mobile phone, your bank accounts, everything's incredibly competitive now. So the consumer has this ability to switch. The consumers are more ESG aware than ever, right? I mean, I remember I was talking to some of the guys earlier, a few years back. I've got 13-year-old twins. We were shopping and they picked up some Nutella and said, "Dad, we're never having Nutella again." I'm like, "Why? What's going on?" And it was because the palm oil, they were cutting down trees, forests to produce palm oil, but it was affecting orangutans at the time. My children were teaching me, these sorts of things. So now we've gone full circle. The company making Nutella and claim to be 97% deforestation free. So the consumers are driving that. And I think that's what's forcing the choice in the market space is equally as important as well.
Yeah. Thomas, would you have anything to add to that?
I think to add to that, when you look at the European market, there is a lot more drive to be ESG compliant, right? That is coming from the consumer. Osapiens is fairly new in the U.S. market, right? We're a fairly large organization in Europe. We've got many different products we sell to EU regulation, but we're fairly new in the U.S. We came to the U.S. We hired an analyst to help us come into the U.S. and they say, "Don't say ESG," right? It's like the worst thing you can say about your company, and it really this solution is an ESG solution that's being driven by the consumers of Europe. So you look at that supply chain you drew up here earlier, and it's easy to say, "Oh, Europe's just trying to have a barrier to entry," right? It's easy to say that, but this is really being driven by the consumer. It's not just the EU, like you said. Some guy sitting in Brussels saying, "What can I write a law about today?" Right? That's not what it's been about.
Yeah. That's great. So if I could stay with you then, just for this next question, what do you see as being the biggest challenges of EUDR for your clients?
Getting the data, right? That is one of the large supplier engagement is one of the largest challenges we're seeing, especially for North America, right? There was a question over here about, what do we just tell EU to go away, right? There's a lot of that we're hearing from our customers, right? Is this something we really want to do when we're looking at tariffs and we're looking at all this regulation? This is the first of many regulations that's going to impact your business that's coming from the EU. You listed a few of them up there earlier, right? CSRD is a potential, CSDDD, digital passport, digital product passport. There's a number of different regulations that are coming down the road that are going to impact your business. And is this investment worth it? And we're seeing some companies say, "Yeah, we want to do this. This is going to be a competitive differentiator for us," right? We're not going to release our European business to somebody else. And we see others saying, we're not sure that we're going to be able to compete, right? We're not sure we're strong enough to be able to do this and compete. So we're seeing supplier engagement being a challenge, and then just the internal initiative that's required inside of an organization to want to change to be able to do this as well.
Yeah, this is definitely something that's across departments and teams, right? This is legal, procurement, IT. Someone's got to implement and own the management of these systems as well as project managers. So you need a strong team to deliver this. But you're right, like you said, the gentleman down there was talking about, do we really have to do that? Trying to convince people to get that data and why you need the data and the specifics of that data to help be for the compliance. is going to be a challenge. But as you mentioned, Thomas, it's going to be a competitive advantage. If you move now, you'll get that edge in competitiveness. You'll take more control over your already complex and convoluted supply chains, and you'll avoid this crazy rush that's going to happen. I mean, there will be a point where people that push back and didn't want to be compliant or for whatever reason, they realise they're going to have to, right? And you don't want to leave that till the last minute, because it's not going to be easy.
No.
Right?
No.
It's not going to be easy. So, get ahead of it.
Yeah. Okay, that brings us on nicely. So Scott, specifically, I mean, when you think you've got the audience here in this room, indirectly or directly, it's got to be less than 5% of their turnover collectively that's, with the EU. There's obviously, we've had the delay last year. There's still a certain amount of uncertainty, things to be decided upon. There's political upheaval in Europe, lots of changes with elections, etc. There's pressure from the administration over here. There would be a great temptation, I can imagine, to just say, look, I'm just going to wait and see. And what would you have to say to someone who's thinking just to see?
You want me to take that one?
That was for you, Scott.
That's Tom.
I'm sorry, Tom.
I'm Scott. It's all right. You're just like me.
That's why he threw you off there.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Scott.
Just to wait and see. I don't genuinely believe. People will make a decision based on the size of the revenues that they're shipping into the EU, right? Some people might say it's just a small amount and it's not worth that challenge. But you are excluding yourself from what is a huge market, right?
Yeah.
There's still massive potential in the EU. And I liked what you said earlier about the potential of creating EU entities, right, to simplify these situations. This can also be something that generates a revenue. If you look at the evolution of these things, right, this could be an opportunity for you guys as well. And the slide you put up about the opportunist in certain situations, I think that's definitely a mindset you're going to need to adopt moving forward with EUDR.
The little bit I'd add to that is, and I'm not as familiar with the publishing industry as some of the other industries that EUDR impacts, but one of the concerns we're seeing from North America is if they give up the EU business, somebody else is going to fill that in the EU, and then are they going to start taking their North America business because they are compliant, they're building a solution, can they actually ship into the US then and start chewing up some of their US business? So we have some companies looking at this as a defensive move as well, to make sure they're not just giving up that 5%, but they're keeping the 95% that they have in the rest of the world.
Absolutely. I'd agree with that. And fundamentally at the heart of all of this, and to the point about the categorization, I think if the EU start categorizing things, the only people that will suffer are the poorest people in the chains, right? Normally, the other commodities, the small holders, the farmers. So I don't believe there will be that much no risk, type categories in this situation as well, because it will be diluted so much it wouldn't be relevant to the commodities at all.
Okay, well, I didn't actually list this as a question, but obviously you guys are working across other industries, so dealing with other commodities are impacted by EUDR. Do you think that our industry has anything to learn from any of those?
I think this is, especially in North America for book publishing, the risk is fairly low as far as the deforestation risk.
Yeah.
So you generally see, certificates and some other things that come into play that are going to mitigate whatever risk is out there. So it's the process of data collection. Yeah. Is it what you have to do in North America? We deal with folks in the cocoa industry, in the coffee industry, where the harvesting of rubber, also where the harvesting is not as straightforward as what we see as pulp and paper, right? So the risk is definitely a greater challenge there. So I think for this group, for this industry, it's really the data collection. It's not about managing the risk. The risk is going to be fairly low. It's about the data collection and being able to support your customers and what they need to do business in Europe.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. By far and away, the biggest opportunity for software vendors like ourselves is timber, right? It's the biggest. It's the biggest market, right? It just is. But I think, right, you guys have this, one of the most nuanced situations, with printers, paper suppliers, and publishers, and all the complexities in between that, more so than the other commodities, right? The other commodity is about gathering data, but it's about how you gather the data because it's harvested in a completely different way to timber, right? So it's a different set of problems. I actually think the other commodities could learn from what you guys would be doing, right? Because what you showed up there, and you spoke about it very eloquently, may I say, what you showed is just the sheer level of complexity and depth you're going to need to be compliant, right? So yes, you're right. The EU will want you to show steps towards it. Do they expect it immediately? I'd be very surprised.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's interesting. It goes back to really the fundamentals. So the spirit of the regulation is ensuring that products are free from deforestation, which, over here we've got a high level of confidence that 99% of that is definitely the case. But all the complexity is actually in demonstrating it, isn't it? It's just, there's two levels, if you like, of compliance. There's the spirit of the law, and then afterwards there's the letter of it, which we're having to do.
Absolutely.
So,
Yep.
So certain elements of this supply chain is going to have the issue of traceability, the end-to-end stuff, right? The data, the geolocation stuff. And then you've got this element of trust, which is where all of this, the DDS statements come into and all the tracking of the product and the data. The publisher's going to have to trust what's being shared, right? So how do you verify that data, right? So you're going to have a really strong and mature supply chain, which is really even more important to what we said earlier about getting ahead of this stuff. Creating yourselves an opportunity rather than waiting, because these are going to be the key things to consider.
Definitely. So if we think a little bit outside of EUDR, we touched on it a little bit earlier, how do you both see the ESG regulatory environment evolving over the coming years? Because we've almost got got two poles to that. Obviously, there was a massive drive in terms of sustainability regulation, as you said, Thomas, driven by the consumer. And then, so there's this wave of regulation coming through. At the same time, there's almost been this kickback from a political standpoint, looking for the omnibus that we had in Europe in terms of simplifying reporting around ESG. You've obviously got, as we said, massive changes in politics in Europe, over here as well. How do you see those two forces playing out and competing with each other? Who's going to win over?
I'll let you take the first shot at that.
Very kind.
Let's wait for the midterms. It's quite clear the direction of travel, particularly with the EU, right? I mean, in the UK alone, I was chatting to a gentleman last night. I was telling him that the UK now have to be fully electric in terms of their vehicles by 2030, right? But what's going to happen is the likelihood is that administration in the UK will lose the next election because the other party are promising to actually let's dilute that a little bit, right? So there's kind of that lack of trust from the consumer, that aspect. So would you rush out and buy an electric car? Probably not, because it don't go far enough and the infrastructure is not there. The same thing applies here, right? Broader ESG legislation will be forced by bodies like the EU, right? Because they want this is one of the key banners that the EU fall under, even though the UK's left the EU. But the EU legislation really is founded on green initiatives. And that's the travel of direction. So what you guys have to do is ensure that, but at the heart of all of this will be traceability and data, right? So you should be able to avoid that scope creep in terms of software solutions or product solutions, and then the different skill sets you have to manage those disparate solutions, right?
Yeah.
You can avoid that kind of scope creep because CSRD, EUDR, CS-DDD, even though CS-DDD has been pushed out a little bit, at the heart of that is showing what your plans are and then proving it, right? But at the heart of that is data. So you should be able to extend the use of these platforms. What I would say.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, because at the end of the day, we know that books isn't a particularly evil industry. We're not using slave labor, etc. We aren't cutting down the Amazon rainforest to produce books, etc. So it's exactly what you say. It's about data, traceability, transparency. And I think the challenge that we've got as a sector is that we haven't traditionally worked like that. We've worked by silo.
Yeah.
We've got the paper mills, printers, the publishers, all focused very much on their own business, but not really engaging across the supply chain to be able to share the data that we need.
I mean, what could come out of this is an element of, let's say, best practice, if that's the right term, the best way of working, like helping collaboration across, a bit like today, guys, you guys are all learning from these conferences. So I think that will come out of it. But you're right. Data silos, disparate data systems. Wow. Like, are we still doing managing a lot of this stuff on paper? Excuse the pun. Or the system's all fragmented. Like, how do you bring that together? How do you overlap that to reduce complexity?
Yeah.
It's a matter of when, not if.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's when is this going to happen? Yes, things might slow down. Probably not for EUDR, but certainly has for CSRD, CSDDD. We'll see what digital product passport brings. Things are slow. Things might have slowed down a little bit, but it's really a matter of when. And we have some customers that are also speaking to us about how do they use this data to improve their business and not just meet a regulatory enforcement, right? You're collecting all this certificate data, license data, all this other things that's mitigating the risk of the deforestation data that we're collecting. Can we use that to identify supplier risk, right? Is there other things that are risky about our supply chain that we can use this data for? So we're spending a lot of time working with our customers to do that as well.
Yeah, okay. That leads us nicely on to the next question. Actually, that was exactly it. So do your clients majority see EUDR and obviously investment in tools that you provide as a cost of doing business, or do they also see it as an opportunity to drive their business forward and develop it?
I would say the initial engagement we have with the vast majority of our customers are, how do we get this done with the least amount of effort, the least amount of work, the least amount of cost? And then when they realize what data they're collecting, what they're pulling in, what they're using, they come back to us afterwards and say, wait a minute, can we do something else, right? So we have folks looking at their master data and using, all this deforestation risk we do, I'm sure yours is the same, is AI driven. Yeah. Right? It's not human driven. It's not people looking at satellite pictures. It's all driven by AI. Right? So can we use this AI platform that you're using for deforestation to help us understand where we have trouble with master data, where we have trouble with supplier risk, where we have trouble with all different sorts of our supply chain. And that's the I think the most interesting part of what we can do here. But the initial engagement is always, can you get us to meet the letter of the law? And how quickly can we do it? And what's the cheapest we can do it for? Right? That's where it always starts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from a software, if I could speak from our perspective as software vendors, I think EUDR will roll on and on and on because you've got this concept of open source, right? Which creates false positives, false negatives. Right, you do that, you exclude people from the supply chain, and then you've got to find alternative supply chain across other commodities, not necessarily here as well, but then you've got to find other areas of supply chain. They start to dictate a price, and all of a sudden the price goes up. Yeah. Another reason to absolutely go early. So what you're going to find is people who've made an early decision based on, Global Forest Watch or utilising JRC, they're going to realise that actually they've just excluded huge portions of or completely disrupted their supply chain by even just excluding one small part of it, right?
Yeah. So maybe unnecessary.
So the AI plays a key part. So the comparison to the JRC, for example, with satellite data, is it really a false negative or a false positive? Where do you lie and where is the truth in that? So utilising that, but it's going to be interesting to see the competent authorities go, right? Because I'm sure you are as well. We're engaged with some of the competent authorities. And they're actually saying AI is great for certain elements, but we won't accept just AI for the legality checks. So then all of a sudden you're introducing this human in the loop. And all the things that we're talking about now is reducing manual processes. It's driving high levels of automation, right? But then they're saying, well, we need to go back to this human in the loop. So then you've got to have lawyers involved. And you've got to have partnerships with the legal team, which both of us absolutely do have, to double down on what the AI is telling you. And it's interesting, ChatGPT says check this information because, when you write into ChatGPT, it can't always be right. And that's kind of the premise of what the EU is doing, the competent authorities are doing with the legality side of it, not the data.
Yeah, wow, okay. The issue is that we're going to have all these different parties doing the same kind of manual checks on the same supply chain.
Yeah.
Somewhere we've got to try and bring it all together so everyone's got almost like a common checking. Always.
But then you've got the EU Traces system. How performant is the EU Traces system? How long is that going to take per check, right? Yeah. How is that going to impact people's businesses, particularly publishers, right? When you think about their storing and all that kind of stuff. So let's see how that plays out. So what you said earlier is absolutely bang on. Mess around if you can with not mess around is probably the wrong term. The test system, use the test system. if you can. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Companies don't want to have to buy a new software solution for every new regulation that comes out. So how do your solutions future-proof businesses against future regulations, some of which we listed earlier, of course, moving forward?
I took the last one first. You want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's so nice to each other.
Friendly.
There's plenty of business out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these platforms are just that. They essentially will become plug and play, just like you would plug and play in with the EU Traces system or to an ERP system, right? You will be able to use the information, the data that you're collecting, and extend that acrost.
So like in a modular way?
In a modular
trunk
way.
And a modular
trunk. Yeah, absolutely. What I'd say about EUDR is, though, this is not like a bolt-on. CSRD and CSDDD are very different in terms of the expectations on people in this room and whether you're a trader or an operator, right? The expectation on that side of the business is completely different. So focusing on EUDR with a specific platform will be super important. But having said that, everything that we gather as software suppliers, software as a service solutions, we will be able to extend that to other ESG use cases,
right,
or environmental use cases, whether it be voluntary or whether it be mandated.
So we have a great number of EU regulations we already support, a number of which don't apply to the folks in this room. But all the data we collect, probably exactly as you do it, right? You could collect master data from ERP, you collect transactional data from ERP, any of that master data that's similar from regulation to regulation, we're going to reuse. We're not going to have you pull it out a second time, right? We do publish all of the future regulations that we're already working on. So we have out there, that our digital product passport is already, going to be out there. The product carbon footprint, corporate carbon footprint, all these ones that are coming out, right? We're supporting. The way the larger players in this market grow is by supporting multiple regulations, not by being a one-off, right? You mentioned 20 different or so vendors in this space.
Yeah.
You pick one that's a one-off, you might be replacing them in a year or two, right? Because this is not a business that is going to continue to grow year after year, right? We're going to have a mad rush over the next 6 to 18 months of people putting this in, and then all of a sudden you're going to have to be on to the next thing as a business. So looking at a vendor that is providing other solutions, maybe not even to you, but other organizations in the world, so that they're continuing to grow and be there is I think fairly important to.
I'd agree with that, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with software everywhere, right?
Well, exactly. And how many integrations then to manage your data?
Yeah, so absolutely, I completely agree.
But one of the things I looked at recently, which is quite interesting, so in one of the exemptions, we've got 100% recycled material, for example, from EUDR. So a number of people, that's great. Why can't we just use recycled paper then to print books? But when you look at the carbon footprint, generally speaking, of recycled paper, it's often significantly worse than virgin paper. And so I can see that it's really important to get a hold on the data side of things and have a common tool that you can look at the trade-offs between some of these things as well to actually drive decisions in how you're managing your supply chain. Because otherwise, if you look at the silo basis EUDR wants and carbon footprint the next, you'd actually make some really bad decisions.
Yeah, and I think at some point, businesses will have to look at how much they have to implement in order just to do business with a particular block, like the European Union, right? I mean, it's hard enough to do business as it is in this current economic climate, macroeconomic climate, and all that kind of stuff, right? But there's nuance in that. There's things like mixing, like, is it 100% recyclable? Where is it all recyclable from one batch, one group, one geographical location?
Exactly.
It's this concept of mass balance. All that needs to come into play. So it's even more nuanced than that.
Thomas?
Yeah, you could make a decision that says I'm simplifying my EUDR reporting, but I'm making my CSRD reporting far more complex, right? So that balance of how do I operate a business that is driving the goals that we need, right? Profitability is obviously one of them, but as a business, are you also driving to have a smaller carbon footprint? Whatever those goals may be, having a platform that lets you manage that and balance
and data-driven, justified decisions on your business.
Exactly. We're kind of looping back to that discussion we briefly had around what other business value can we get out of collecting all of this data for regulatory purposes.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Okay, so deep diving a little bit onto your respective solutions. How do your solutions address the core requirements of EUDR? We mentioned, of course, traceability, due diligence, collection of geolocations, and particularly the deforestation risk assessment, potentially mitigation options. It's really interesting. I did a test the other week when we looked at 2 different solutions for assessing the geolocations. And I was astounded, to be honest, at the variety of responses we got between, there's deforestation there, risk, here there isn't, from 2 different solutions. And unfortunately, of course, EUDR doesn't provide for a defined standard measure. And so that's an absolute minefield when you're looking at this. You could come up with completely false positives in terms of the testing you're doing on that data. So particularly interested in those aspects.
You could run, I've seen tests run where there's deforestation in the middle of the sea. Right, it's crazy, but it is taking the JRC and then the satellite data over the top of that, and using AI to run that comparison. And it's really interesting how many times it comes out with open source that it's deforestation. There's deforestation detected, as opposed when you run the satellite data over the top. But also look at land use change over time. How is the usage of that land change, particularly when you look at the edge of forests, for example, the edges of forest, or reforestation even. So have a look at land use over a period of time. And then it's making sure you're arming the producers with the right information, because they send you plots with a dwelling on it. And then deforestation is detected, but there's no deforestation, it's the dwelling. So you need to think about the plot that you're providing. So
and the granularity, I suppose.
The granularity, So making sure they're armed with the information that they need. And then on top of that, automating the questionnaires and simplifying it. I saw a questionnaire where you literally need a rocket science degree to be able to answer it right, let alone in other commodities where you're talking about some people are technology challenged and all that kind of stuff. They're never going to answer it. And then on the legality side of things, it's automating as much as you can in that chain, but then making sure that you've got the coverage with the right legal support, right?
Yeah, when you need it.
Yeah. Clearly being able to collect all the data and analyzing it from multiple different sources. Yeah. Right. So it's not just looking at the EU deforestation database, but it's pulling all sorts of sources, and there's plenty of public and private sources out there that you can use to analyze, and not having an open source geospatial analysis being done, right? Having a solution that's purpose built for that clears a lot of that up, and then making sure all the legality checks are offsetting whatever risk it comes in, and using AI on top of that to do it all, absolutely minimize the amount of manual effort that needs to go into this.
I am concerned about your reference to them requiring manual review of some documents as well, because
we've heard it from the Czech authorities, the Dutch authorities. They're really going to push for not just AI only legality checks. They're going to push for human in the loop, essentially. Lawyers, right?
Yeah, inevitably adds significant cost to it.
Yeah, it's going to add cost to the initial, and that's one element that's never going to change, right? The software platform, once it's produced, right?
Yeah.
You sell it. But when you've got that element, there is always going to be a fixed cost to it. So then you have to drive the value of that fixed cost. So it can't be a yes or a no. It has to be a yes, or these are the additional things you might need to find out. You need to go and discover. This is how you do it in order to become compliant on that. Yeah.
Okay. And so how, on a very practical level, how do you go about collecting the data? So in our instance here, if we're talking about printers, how do printers work with your solutions to actually gather the data, the raw data from the paper mills? How is that managed?
So it's going to start with getting the data out of your own systems, right? So we're going to need all the master data around products and suppliers to start with, and then the transactional data, right? So once we know where the purchase order is coming from, going out to that supplier and start collecting that data. So there's multiple different ways a supplier can feed data into the system. Manual, right? Go out to a portal and type it in. It could be geolocation data where they're looking at a map and clicking on dots on a map and creating a map. They can upload GeoJSON data. They can upload all different ways. CSV, yeah. Excel files. There's all sorts of ways. You can, XML files. There's all sorts of ways you can upload data into the system from a manual perspective. We also support full APIs. So a lot of the mills are running SAP or some large ERP platform. We can gather the data that is available from out of those systems right into our system so that they don't need to enter it. Lots of different ways, right? So gathering the data, we try and make as simple as possible. Make it as easy for your suppliers to engage with you as they need to engage, right? They can set time periods up so that they're not have to put every single purchase order data in. So over the next 6 months, they know they're all going to be harvesting from the same location. Anything you send me over the next 6 months, here's the data that's already there, already available, right? Okay. So it's not have to re-enter every single time. Same is true with certificates and licenses and everything else that you're going to have to upload. So we try and simplify the engagement with suppliers, so it's not you spending a lot of time, pulling teeth, right?
Yeah. We need their buy-in if we've got a chance of
making it as easy as possible.
I mean, what can you take from a PO order, from a purchase order? What information can you take? Product, how much, date, all that kind of stuff. So integration with ERPs is clearly the most important thing. Yep. But as you said, like uploading GeoJSON files, manually drawing plots. The thing about this solution is that you shouldn't adapt your flows to work with a software tool. We need to be able to integrate and work with your flows, right? And how you do things. And you showed a flow earlier, right? You were showing the various flows, whether you're a non-EU supplier or an EU supplier. One looked vastly more complex than the other.
Sure.
Yeah, right?
Definitely.
And then by industry, it looks vastly more complex again. And then where you sit in that industry in terms of the supply chain, it looks vastly more. So it's we need to adapt to what you guys are doing and then help you automate those parts of the chain where we can. Right, so reduce that. So a lot of people now will buy by business case or TCO or ROI. It's like automation is one of the key things, right? How many people hours can we reduce in certain elements of this process?
Sure. And then if we could move on, the next logical step is the integration, obviously, with EU traces. I assume both of you are. Absolutely. And also, how are you sharing then data downstream with those users that need it? I mean, in the graph that we had earlier, the publishers or the retailers?
It's really the same as working with suppliers. So they have a portal that they can go to and download the due diligence statements that were submitted. We have the ability to pull that data back into your own ERP system, whether it's SAP or somebody else, so to include it as a document that goes along with the shipment itself. They can have an API to grab the data right out of the portal. Our business in EUDR is growing very, very rapidly because we have a lot of retailers that are using us for EUDR, and they're going to their suppliers and saying, put it on Osapiens because I can grab it right. It just shows up on the portal for me once you submit it, right? So there's a lot of different ways to make that data available to your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And no supply chain is going to have the same software provider all the way through, right? So you've got to treat this concept of a commercial network. So suppliers from Trader 1 can go to N1, N2, N3, N4, and so on and so forth, all the way down. And know the specific data that they need to share. And then be able to export that data and then share it in a format that makes sense to the next person in the chain, right? So, absolutely.
So really specifically, you might not know the answer to this, but either of your systems, have you already done an integration with any of the common MIS systems in book printing? So for instance, Technique or anything like that?
I have to be honest and say I don't know that answer.
I don't know either.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So next question. Given the volume of data, the number of transactions involved, which, as I say, can go into thousands and thousands and thousands of lines, how do you manage for automation? And we mentioned touched AI earlier, but what other automation tools do you have in your suites?
Do you want to start that one?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what we're talking about specifically. Are we talking about AI use for geospatial analysis data, or analysis of that data, or satellite data? Are we talking about AI to drive data collection? So it depends on what part of the chain we're discussing, really. But AI has a really good use case when it simplifies what people have to provide. So the data collection itself, right? So automating the forms, the questionnaires, the data gathering, all that kind of stuff. But then making it super clear, regardless of like where you sit within that chain, what information needs to be gathered, right? So all of that's taken care of within the system. So yeah, we can drive automation through whatever part of the chain you need to. As I say, you will need the human in the loop and the legality checks.
Yeah, okay.
I think one of the other areas, and you alluded to this earlier in your first presentation, is, you produce a book, you might have 50 different suppliers that you're creating this book from.
It's scary. Yeah.
And how do I align the data that's coming from my raw material suppliers or my material suppliers to what's going into that physical book, right? So it's not just the deforestation data and the legal data and all that kind of stuff. It's actually also making sure we're tracking
and mapping it to the product
in your system, right? How did that book? What due diligence statements that you ascertain from your suppliers need to get associated with that book that's going into Europe, right? So there's that part of it too that needs to be thought through. In
the end-to-end traceability, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely some work to do internally in terms of existing ERP solutions and ensuring we've got that mapping throughout the production process. Yeah, great. So really practical level, how long does it take to onboard a new customer? How long is it before they're operational with your tools?
It depends. I mean, you're going to get an "it depends" answer from me. I don't think you're right. It depends on the size, right? You have SME. You mentioned SME customers are June of next year. Larger businesses are December of this year. If you're a large organization, you're integrating to some ERP system, you're having some of your suppliers integrate to ERP systems, some of your customers integrate to ERP systems, you're looking at a 3 to 6 month process probably. An SME customer can be up in a week or two, right? Because they're doing everything via portals. So it really depends on what level of integration you're looking for, the complexity of your business, the complexity, the legality. If you're pulling geospatial data out of South America or Asia, where there's a lot more risk, right? There's going to be challenges to that. So it really depends a bit, anywhere from a couple of weeks to several months.
And that's keeping in mind that we might not have any live data, as I said earlier, until later in the summer at the earliest.
Right.
Ask ChatGPT and see how long it takes. That would be interesting, right? And ChatGPT will tell you probably 2 to 4 weeks. The reality is you can stand up a piece of software tomorrow. Can you integrate it with your existing systems tomorrow? No. Can you get all of the data from your supply chain that you need tomorrow? No. That part is a 3-month process. Right?
Yeah.
So, and then that's when the AI and the automation level comes on top of that. So it really does depend on, it actually depends on a lot of things: the size of the company, number of suppliers, for sure, right? Actually, the commodity, the change of the commodity, the HS codes. There's all sorts of things that you need to think about, and then there might be unique flows, which there are in publishing, right?
Definitely. Okay, and final question from me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. But what are the biggest hurdles that you've encountered in onboarding new clients? And what would be the key success factors that you would identify in a successful onboarding?
You want to go?
Sure. One, master data is always one, right? Prior to coming to Osapiens, I spent 25 years with SAP, so I'm familiar with the challenges of master data, right? That's always one that's a challenge. I will say we've never once in my career I've ever taken on a project that had perfect master data, right? So a lot of folks are using that as a potential stumbling block, but it needs to be addressed. Supplier engagement is probably number 2, especially when it comes to engaging suppliers that are in North America, right? There is this. I don't think I need to do that, right? That's a European thing, right? So engaging suppliers in North America is certainly one that's becoming that's been a challenge, but is becoming less of a challenge, right? More and more organizations are realizing this is something they need to deal with. And then it's just the process change, what business process changes are going to occur, because there are going to be business process changes. It's not just turning on a piece of software, you entering in the data and everything is the same as it was. There are certainly going to be things that you have to change in your process in order to make this work.
Yeah, data silos is key, right? I mean, there's always disparate data sets, silo data everywhere, different formats. Do you need to convert that data into a format that's consistent? There's change management. There's change management from the industry, but there's also change management within. There's always someone that that's done things a certain way and is resistant to change because it makes them feel uncomfortable, or a group of people that make them feel uncomfortable. Yeah. So part of the job of us as software providers also needs to be to handle that situation, educate. Not educate in the sense of what you do or why EUDR, but how it's going to adapt and support you in the way you're going to work, how it might make things easier in the longer run, even though there's some pain up front. So change management is key. But in terms of success, and on the flip side of that, this is a cross-functional thing, right? Legal, procurement, technical, heads of ESG, for example. So you're going to need strong project management, and you're going to need leadership across all of those environments and those groups. So if you can get that level of structure implemented, then you can make this as a fairly smooth, but after everything we've discussed today, but you can make this an easier proposition than what it is, because it's like you have the conversation with your kids about homework and stuff, right? They're all like, oh my God, Dad, I can't do this. Break it down into small chunks, right? Yeah. Take pieces away, take pieces out. Who can take control of this part? What groups need to take control of this? Who's going to own it? And then once you've got that strong leadership, you should be able to move forward with it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. So, obviously here we're focused on the data and how we're managing that, etc., to demonstrate compliance. This is obviously impacting the whole organization. I've heard a few people say we've got an EUDR task force in place. There's IT, procurement, operations, sales, distribution involved. That's really important. And then also it's actually impacting the relationship with suppliers and customers, potentially the contractual relationships. And so you also got to look at it strategically, and then bring in, of course, legal, etc. So it's great. Thanks very much, gents. At this point, we've got some time to open up to the floor.
Thank you, guys. And just to give everybody a little color around this, we reached out, and one of Matt's earlier slides showed you there's a ton of software solutions out there, right? So first of all, we really appreciate Osapiens and LiveEO coming out and joining us. This was, fantastic. But at the same time, I also want to say BMI does not endorse any software programs for this. So we did bring them out, but and we're very happy that they are here and shared their information with us. But there are a ton of them out there. But honestly, we reached out to a handful and asked them to participate. And so we do give some preferential treatment to these fine gentlemen because they did make sure to take time out to share their information and knowledge with us, because they see the book market as important in this whole thing. So we do thank you guys for coming out and appreciate that. So, and as the guy who is very stern about how we run our meetings, I also thank them for not making it a sales pitch, right? Because that's an important part of this. I know some of you are like, man, it really would have been cool to get a demo. You can talk to them at break, get their cards, and schedule the demo for next week, okay? I'm sure they'll be happy to do that. But one of the things we talk about in with books, it's not just the paper, right? It's the end sheets, it's the board, it's everything. And we have a lot of those folks in this room. So if there are any folks in the wood product category, imagine that in a room full of books, that have anything to say, want to tell us where you guys are at or anything else, please raise your hand. I'm happy to give you the mic. Jack.
Gentlemen, thank you. As a paper supplier to the book industry, we're being asked to be EUDR compliant with unclear guidelines from the EUDR. And heard you say, Matt, that we're going to be maybe medium risk or whatever for everybody. Yet I heard some of the gentlemen here say, well, it's a low deforestation risk in North America, which we believe it is. So we're being asked to do this stuff. We're trying to design everything. And it's very difficult when you're not sure what you're doing. Are you doing something that you really don't need to do, or you have to do it? And then let me keep going. So that you talk about pulp mills. What if you're an integrated mill, you have your own pulp, and oh, by the way, the chips come from next door, the sawmill's next door, and you know where they come from, but they go to the chip pile, and then they go to the silos, and they go into the pulping process, and you have to tell me where that roll of paper came from? Now, you're asking the impossible. There's not a mill in the world that can do that. I will tell you. So it's interesting. You know, I think they're putting the cart ahead of the horse in this awesome. We're trying to do stuff, the UDR is. But I got one more thing written down. Yeah, you talked about pulp. I think you were talking more about pulp log situation. What about residual chips that go in the sawmill? We put the log in the sawmill. You know, we don't get that. But I did hear positives, data. So if that's all we need to do, we can provide that. So it's just unclear. At least I'm hopefully from our side.
Just to clarify one thing, whether you're low risk, standard risk, high risk, the data that you're supposed to provide is the same. It's the subsequent actions in terms of risk assessment and mitigation that are different depending on that risk categorization. So, I mean, I think the data, the exact definition of the data that needs to be collected is set in stone now. That's unlikely to change. So there's a clear definition from that point of view. But then afterwards, exactly what format you need to provide that with to customers, et cetera, is something you need to work on in terms of engagement.
You're saying the data is clear. By that, you mean we can tell you where the logs came to into the sawmill. So we know that. But beyond that, it's difficult to tell you when that got into the paper making process. So how do you, that gap there?
Well, that's the thing, and you have that issue at every stage in the supply chain. It's about mapping that product or that raw material as it's going through production and processing. You're absolutely right, but then there's some printers who don't have ERP solutions where they're barcoding every single reel of paper to a job, etc. So the whole industry undoubtedly is going to have to, in order to be compliant, if they choose to be so, is going to have to adapt some of their internal processes and their existing systems to ensure that traceability internally as well as externally with third parties.
Barcode on and so the printer. So the printer has to scan that thing in.
Into a job, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. That's relatively simple compared to what you were saying.
That's easy. It's the other parts that are hard.
Yeah. And there are ways within the law to address that, knowing that stuff's going into a pile as opposed to, making a discrete piece of furniture, right? There are ways to do that. It's more than a 15 or 30 second answer. So we can certainly address that at one of the breaks and explain how independently our systems do that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. The FAQs haven't been very useful, generally speaking, but there is one specific I've got in mind in terms of silo and raw materials and some assumptions, if you like, that might help.
I live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, right? We have Amish folks that make furniture, and their chips go into producing paper, right? There's a big paper mill just outside of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Oh, wow. They're not collecting where those trees came from, right? Sometimes they're from my backyard. I live in the woods in Lancaster County. I've had trees in my backyard go to these folks. So there's going to be challenges here, right? There really are. And when we say there's going to be less risk, when I say lower risk, it's really a matter of how much labor are you going to need to analyze the due diligence statements before they get submitted, not how much data I have to collect, right? So if you were selling coffee beans or you were selling chocolate bars, you're going to need to set aside a lot more manpower in order to look at those due diligence statements before they go in versus being in the industry you're in.
Yeah, 100%.
Sorry if I wasn't too clear on that. Yeah.
No, that's great. And folks, BMI, we're committed to creating some sort of help when we can. And as I'm sure you've heard in the last couple hours, there's not a whole lot that we as the association can do right now to help you get compliant, mostly because the FAQs aren't great. Traces, I can't get into it. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know a lot of things. So I would say this has been some of the best information that I've seen in the last 2 years on this. So for those of you who if this is your first kind of taste of EUDR info, this has been fantastic. For a lot of us, I see a lot of heads nodding in this room who've sat in on other I mean, obviously we're closer to I don't know if it's the starting line or the finishing line, but we're close enough to EUDR that I think maybe that helps, but these guys have been fantastic. So, and yeah, coming your way, Joe.
I got a question on the policing of this. From what I'm hearing is they're too proud to say this is impossible, we're going to postpone it. But that being said, you think the way they're going to get by with that is not to police it. Is that your understanding, or is that what you think's going to happen?
Not precisely, but I mean, I'm not a betting man, but I'd say, if you like, in terms of enforcement, I don't imagine that they're going to come down like a ton of bricks on the first printer on the 1st of January. They will be doing checks on us, and this is where I think it's really important that, I mean, even if it's very, very difficult or even impossible to reach compliance, I think it's really important to show goodwill, to show the efforts, to document everything that we're doing to be compliant, and then I think you've got a better chance, if you like, of lenient treatment by the national competent authorities. And again, I don't think that our industry, the book industry, is in the headlights of this regulation initially. We're kind of being dragged along for the ride, much as we enjoy it. But so that's my belief and my hope, because again, I go back to the factor I said earlier. If in the best scenario, we're going to only have data to show compliance on products for Q3, Q4 this year, so there's still going to be tens and tens of millions of books sitting in warehouses that people are going to want to export to the EU, for which we're going to struggle to demonstrate compliance. And so that's going to be the test, I think, when we start sending those books in. They are going to get checks, and then we're going to get into a bit of a testing field about how lenient or not they are going to be with us, but we'll see.
I would, if I could just add a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anybody in the EU regulatory body that believes this is impossible, right? There's already EU regulations that do this for other industries. They're just taking on a much wider swath of the industry. You look at the tobacco industry in the EU, you buy a pack of cigarettes in the EU, it's serialized. You can chase that pack of cigarettes back to the farm the tobacco came from. Fish in the Nordics, you can go to the grocery store, scan the barcode at the grocery store, and it'll tell you what fishing vessel it came from. Right? This tracing, this trackability is being done in Europe. It's just at a much, much broader scale, and actually at a slightly less level of detail than other industries are doing it. So I don't think impossibility is one of the things they're thinking of right now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but I'd also, I would go to your point, Matt. I mean, if there's an example to be made, I think it's elsewhere.
Yeah.
This will be like GDPR, right? GDPR, everyone's like, I don't need GDPR. And then you've got the nuances of each country. For Germany, for example, you double opt-in or double opt-out, whatever it would be. And then all of a sudden, these big household names get fined that you hear of. Then everyone clambers on and becomes compliant. I think we may see something similar here. It's hard to say. But what I would say for you guys in this room, I think Matt's exactly right. And, you know, Chatham House and all that, this is just my opinion. I think it would be harsh for them if you're showing steps towards compliance and understanding, and you're working hard on that, and you can demonstrate it. I think it would be super harsh for any competent authority to come down on those first publishers on 1st of January. That's my belief as well, Matt.
Yeah, they certainly appreciate that more than us just telling them it's impossible, your thing go away.
But yeah, it's about asking the right questions, right? I mean, the gentleman down here made a few points, and then we unraveled it a little bit in a minute, and we probably got an answer for that via the FAQs or some other route, right? Yeah. So it's about like really digging into that, and the FAQs are readily available. I would suggest that, you know, we all get familiar with those FAQs, because that covers everything from data to, you know, what your responsibility should be and the requirements of gathering of that data, all the way through to landing product and what that looks like. So probably best to have a look at the FAQs.
I know you said earlier, both of our companies use legal firms in Europe to make sure the software building is actually compliant with the law. The latest list of FAQs came out. I'm sure you guys are running a webinar. We're running a webinar later this week to talk about what that actually means to the to the law. So we do education as well as trying to sell you software too. Right? So.
It's interesting with those simplifications. Essentially, nothing changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed.
Just repackaged.
They called it simplifications, but your obligations are the same.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there was a big PR effort there, I think, with that announcement.
So then you just need to understand what the differences are between year one and year two in terms of your suppliers. Obviously, if you're on board a new supplier, you need to start again. But if there are no changes, then what's your obligation in terms of raising due diligence and all that kind of stuff. So that's where it's super important to really get into the detail there.
Yeah. Agreed.
So guys, the EU regulations are one thing. Here in the US, we've got pending extended producer responsibility, which is new to us. Europe's got it already. And then we have carbon accounting, which is coming on hot and heavy now everywhere.
Yep.
Everyone in this room is being asked on a regular basis right now already about somehow accounting for and data tracking scopes 1, 2, and 3. And most of us, our eyes roll back in our head and we say, well, how are we going to solve for this? You add EPR to that, which I'm sure several people in the room don't even know what it is. Are your software solutions going to be able to help and or solve for that here in the US on top of EUDR?
Yes, it should be. It should be. These things from us or other vendors should be, what's the right term? Compliance agnostic, regulation agnostic. It should extend, right? Because you're being asked essentially the same question time and time again for different requirements. So it should be extensible, and you should avoid that scope creep. Absolutely. So when you're working with a software vendor, dig into that and understand how else and where else they can help you. But even if they can't now, the data sets are exactly the same. They're not that different. You're being asked the same questions. We should be able to extend that via integration and APIs and all these sorts of things. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, when I was 15 years in print, we weren't the best with data, to be honest with you, and I think there is a degree of professionalization of how data is managed and manipulated within the industry that needs to come along to be able to support us with this changing environment, and also just, again, to make data-driven decisions in a quickly changing world in order to make right decisions about our business. We talked about, you've got trade-offs every day between costs, compliance, carbon footprint, EUDR, etc. If you haven't got the data to hand, if you're not regularly collecting that data, it's really difficult to make those decisions. And I mean, I remember when I was at CPI, we had armies of people working on Excel spreadsheets, etc., doing exports. I mean, there are so many tools out there today to manage data lakes, data warehouses, and business intelligence tools, plus software solutions such as we have there, to actually use that data to drive our performance, save on costs, and to improve the business.
Yeah, I was going to say, the modern data stack is both huge and complex and massively expensive, right? You have access to the data you need. So it's about how you extract that data and abstract that data and then manipulate it to get the answers that you need. That should all come from the same platform, right?
Well, and just to put a bow on this, if you go to the resources section of the BMI website, there is an EUDR link. We've got a few things on there now. I'll upload the latest link to the new FAQs, and I'll also dump these presentations and videos on that page as well for folks to find easily. But we want to make sure we continue to give you guys the most up-to-date information as we can, and we'll continue to work on that. So once again, just a big hand for these guys for helping us out here.
Thank you.